First of all, I'd like to express my thanks to the DT Institute, which provides generous support for the series. Of course, also the Blavatnik School of Government and Pembroke College, the Minerva Research Initiative, and my team, especially Frederick, who brought us all together. Before we start, I would also just like to say a few words on International Women's Day today. It's generally celebrated to acknowledge the acts of courage and resolve by ordinary women to support their communities or countries. And so I think, given the theme of this webinar series, it's a really good opportunity to acknowledge those women who are in settings of violence and instability, who fight violence and insecurity, and who are basically tireless in helping others move forward in places, I mean, if you think about it today, such as Ukraine, Somalia, Afghanistan, Iran, and elsewhere. So I'd just like to acknowledge that. Today is the fourth webinar in our series on global security that we hold every Wednesday. And since the Oxford term comes to an end this week, we have a break now, but then we resume again in Trinity term on Wednesday, the 26th of April. And as I explained also in the previous sessions, the purpose of the webinar series is to explore the meaning and practice of global security. Forms part of our research program here at Oxford on global security, in which we study how local contested spaces, transnational flows, illicit flows, and other supply chains and shifts in global order influence each other, and how these interactions may lead to threats to global security. Today, we begin looking at how global security emerges from the dynamic interactions of three dimensions. First of all, the political dimension, by which I mean global order and geostrategic power. Then secondly, the economic dimension, that is these transnational licit and illicit supply chains. But then also the social dimension, which refers to local experiences of stability or instability. Today's webinar and the following two ones focus on each of these dimensions, and then we bring them together to discuss the ways in which they interact dynamically. And that also lies at the core of my own research here. So in each session, we also bring together academics with policymakers or practitioners from around the world to make sure that the intellectual engagement also helps tackle real-world security challenges. So last week, for example, we discussed the scales and spaces of global security, and then teased out some action points, which is, first of all, that we need to recognize the interests of different actors at the local, the national, the transnational, and global levels, and how they intersect. And then secondly, that there is a need for collaboration among different actors at these varying levels to develop solutions together, rather than imposing solutions designed, for example, at a global level onto local actors. And then thirdly, we also found that we need to recognize the potential of different spaces to global security. We discussed the relevance of outer space for climate change and disease monitoring, for example, but also of local spaces and informing solutions to security issues. Of course, we are also interested in hearing from our audience members, and that's why we have prepared a very quick poll. So I'd like to ask my colleague Frederick to run it here. We can see it. So if the audience member can just tick whatever option they agree with most. So the question here is, threats to global security are primarily the product of, I know you can choose political interests by states or economic interests by private actors, the failure of governments to address people's grievances, or a combination of the above options. And I would suggest we wait a little bit longer to see if more people want to just come in here. And in the meantime, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Now, we are unfortunately missing one speaker. I wish she was here, Samira Duale. I don't know, there might be technological issues. I hope she can join later. She is a research consultant. I will just also introduce her. She has very relevant knowledge. She worked in the office of the Prime Minister of the Federal Government of Somalia as a policy advisor, mainly on gender, youth, and security affairs. And she's also worked with the Somali National Army. So hopefully we can still bring her in later. Then I'd also like to introduce Thomas Tieko, who is an associate professor of political science in King's University College at the University of Western Ontario. And he is an award-winning author. Among many books, he has authored on the Legan School of International Relations. I'm also delighted to have Igor Gretzky with us, who joined the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute as a research fellow in July 2022. And up until spring 2002, he was an associate professor at the School of International Relations in St. Petersburg State University in Russia. Then another speaker I'm delighted to introduce is Samuel Makinda. Samuel is professor of international relations and security studies at Murdoch University. And in addition to numerous other recognitions, Samuel received Kenya's Medal of Elder of the Order of the Burning Spear for his distinguished service rendered to the nation by President Mwai Kibaki in 2011. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce our very own Oxford-based Rana, professor here at the University of Oxford, who works on the emergence of nationalism in modern China, both in the early 20th century and in the present era. And he has authored countless books, including, for example, the book on China's war with Japan that was named as the 2013 Book of the Year in the Financial Times and The Economist. And he was also named a 2014 Choice Outstanding Academic Title, among many other recognitions. So welcome all. Again, let's hope Samira can join us later. Let's just have a quick look at the poll. I think that's quite telling. It looks like everyone in the audience thinks that it's really about a combination of political interests, economic interests, but also the failure of governments to address people's grievances, or perhaps some of them. So I look forward to discussing this also more with you to see how those different dimensions come in. And of course, when we think about the political dimension, the question is, what do we mean by that? Isn't everything political, right? Political meaning in terms of exerting power or influence. To what extent can we even talk about that only at the state level? Or is that also something that we need to look at, basically cutting across different levels of analysis? So I'd like to start with a question. Perhaps we can start with Rana and Igor to ask you both, how are geopolitics and balances of power relevant of global to global security? And it would be great if you can just, of course, include here your perspective on China and on Russia, given your expertise. How is that really important to global security? Rana, maybe if you would like to start, that would be great.
Very happy to lead off. And again, may I offer first my congratulations, if that's the right word, or celebrations of International Women's Day. For those who do Chinese history, it's a very relevant day, not least because one of the most famous interactions between Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao as he would become, and Ding Ling, one of the great feminist writers of 20th century China, took place over the real meaning of International Women's Day, and March 8th, 1943 remains a very core date in terms of that interaction. So I mark it here. Let's then move to something rather more contemporary, and the question of global order and how it links to global security. And I'm going to speak just for a minute or so about the Chinese dimension of this, because I think that actually the biggest shift that's probably happened in the last 20, 25 years is the way in which China's decisions on these issues influence and ripple through to a whole variety of decisions that go way beyond the shores of China or what happens centrally in Beijing. I would say that there is a paradox, is maybe too strong, but I think a contradiction, which, as you know, is a good Hegelian Marxist word. There's a contradiction at the heart of China's attitude towards the international order at the moment. Because sometimes the question gets asked, is China a revisionist power, or is it looking really to maintain the status quo? And the answer is very much both. But the status quo it wants to maintain is one that actually is powerfully revised in various ways. I'm thinking here about things of great concern to this group and to the Blavatsky School, which is international organizations, in which growing Chinese influence, not least fueled by the fact that China is now the second biggest payer of dues into the UN by certain standards, means that it feels it has more right to make those choices. And I think in every single case, there is a sort of calculation being made as to whether it's better to stick to what the system has now, or to shift? So quick examples. Number one, something that needs to shift. I would say that the way in which China has used the Human Rights Council as a way of shifting definitions of human rights away from individual civil liberties towards a much more holistic economic and development-based set of ideas. I'm not here at this point making a judgment whether this is good or bad. I'm just saying it's a shift that's notable and it is a significant revision. In some other areas, I don't see at the moment that there is actually any great move from China to shift international order. World Trade Organization, China fought hard to get in. In some ways, there's an argument that China has maybe been a better upholder of WTO standards in the last decade or so than at least at times the United States has been. And then the one that I think gets us to where this conversation will go and where I'll hand over. A couple of the two big geopolitical issues, one is Russia-Ukraine, one is Taiwan. And in both of those cases, I think that actually it's not entirely clear to Beijing as to whether this is, as we'd say in cards, stick or twist with the international order. With Russia-Ukraine, it's clear that the official position, at least at the UN and national level, remains that China is a neutral actor and that it doesn't take sides between Russia and Ukraine, and it does recognize, it says, Ukraine's sovereignty. However, it's very clear that many aspects of behavior, when we think about the global economic order, on everything from fossil fuels to cereal exports to the international banking system, there is a lot that China's doing, which is not outside the sanctions regime, but it's very clear that is pushing things in the direction of a revisionist Russia, a Russia which seems to me to be much keener to overturn that order. And my final note is that on Taiwan, we don't yet know. In the next few years, I think that Beijing will possibly make up its mind. I don't think Beijing knows yet either quite where it sits on this. And the fork in the road is essentially a maintenance of the existing order and the status quo, a very fragile status quo on Taiwan, which essentially means that the Asia-Pacific economic sphere continues to expand, China's economy continues to grow. We've seen this 5% target rate set by the Chinese government. That's what they want. Or to go in the direction of a unification of Taiwan, possibly coercive. I think it's unlikely, I will say that clearly, but if it were to happen, that would knock the global economic order into a turbulent situation that makes the current Ukraine-Russia influence situation seem trivial in comparison. So those are the cards that could be played, Annette, and I'm looking forward to this conversation as to how they may be deployed.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Rana. I think it was really interesting how you already tied together kind of the political and economic aspects, right? We can't really think about global order without looking at how the economy comes in. And you also already touched upon the other states that we are, of course, here also discussing. You mentioned China recognizes Ukraine's sovereignty, what the implications there are as well. And of course, that brings us to Russia's foreign policy, also vis-a-vis Ukraine and other countries. Igor, would you like to pick up the conversation here and tell us your view on that?
Yes, thank you very much. And I would like to briefly describe how Russia views the global order and the global security in general. Well, first of all, I would like to say that what the current leadership of Russia thinks about the global order is not something new, because actually the way, the style, and the ideas, I mean, the Kremlin articulates nowadays, all of them are actually inherited. Most of them, they are inherited from the Soviet era. One of them is fundamental, is absolutely fundamental. This idea says that there are basically 6 to 7 or probably 8 great powers that are 100% sovereign and that are able to project their interests abroad. And this is how the Kremlin perceives the international relations, the geopolitics nowadays. But of course, Vladimir Putin and his associates, they believe that Russia is one of those 6 to 7 poles of this geopolitical order, together with China, the United States, of course, India, Brazil, and several other countries. But there are some specificities of Russia's perception, because what they sometimes, well, geopolitics is a very, very complicated notion, and it has several definitions. But in fact, for the Russian leadership, geopolitics is not only about geography and power. It includes geostrategic thinking, identity, and all this. It's a much more multidimensional word. At the same time, when it comes to Russia's, of course, I mean, like the Kremlin believes that they're kind of one of those 6 or 7 poles. And it means that for the Kremlin, they have the right to have a sphere of influence, a sphere of special interests. And how to define where this sphere of influence lies? It's easy when it comes to Russian foreign policy. Moscow believes that its sphere of special interests includes post-Soviet states, actually, and partly the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. Here I can remind you of the so-called Lavrov's ultimatum as of December 2021, where he said that actually NATO should decrease its military potential in those states which joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization after 1997, that is Central and Eastern European states. So it means that Putin's appetites, they spread far beyond the post-Soviet states. Another sign is that what approach the Kremlin applies with regard to the post-Soviet states. Have a look at Ukraine, have a look at Georgia. Vladimir Putin and Lavrov, Minister of Foreign Affairs, they apply so-called solidarist narratives, that is, responsibility to protect. They used the defense of Russian-speaking population rights, the protection of Russian-speaking population rights in Ukraine, for instance, as a pretext to annex Crimea and to invade Ukraine in 2022. But when it comes to the rest of the world, the narrative is different, absolutely different. In fact, Russia says, well, it's all the countries are absolutely sovereign. The government are absolutely legitimate. So whatever the government does, it is actually, so they have the right to do that, which this concept is not applied with regard to post-Soviet states. So this is the difference. So this is how it works. This is how it looks like. And this is how Russia uses those narratives to substantiate its foreign policy.
Right. Thank you so much. Thanks, Igor. I mean, you pointed out the relevance of narratives, right? It's not only about what the interests are, but of course also how they are presented, what the perceptions are, or what kind of perceptions states want to create. Now, we heard about the potentially coercive attitude to China vis-a-vis Taiwan, of course, Russia's military aggression to Ukraine. But of course, there is also another element here to security, which is perhaps not always the military one. And Samuel, I'd like to pick up what you promoted in the past as well, which is the idea of a non-military security. So could you elaborate a little bit on how you would say political interests and perhaps also those with this coercive background, how they intersect with other dimensions of global security, perhaps more in terms of the social dimension, thinking about people, think about what happens on the ground from your point of view?
Thank you very much, Annette. I think my idea of non-military security is not quite original, although I started arguing about it when I was just about to go to study for my PhD. I published an article in which I argued that we have to pay attention to non-military factors. But I find that as a person who was taught by people trained in the English school, including Henry Bull himself, I got the impression that there is always a transition from military factors to non-military factors. And if you take the example of Hedley Bull's The Anarchical Society, for instance, he talks about the balance of power as being one of the 5 institutions of international society. And he relates this institution to other institutions. And he says there are 5 institutions which are so important that without them, there can't be order in the world. And the other institutions include war, diplomacy, international law, and great power management. And his argument was that all these 5 institutions are so crucial for international order that without them, we cannot even talk about great powers or small powers. We cannot talk about spheres of influence or anything else. And then he goes on to talk about justice in international relations or justice in international society. And he moves away from international justice, which applies to states, to human justice, which applies to human beings. And in his argument, he says, according to natural law, human justice preceded justice among states. In fact, in his own words, he argued that states and nations were originally thought to have rights and duties because individual persons had rights and duties. Therefore, from that perspective of Hedley Bull, one can argue that the security of individuals or individual human beings is prior to the security of states. In fact, based on this, I believe that geopolitics and balances of power need to be considered relevant to global security only if security is defined in terms of the protection of people and the preservation of their values, norms, rules, and institutions. That is how I came to look at the non-military dimension of security. I was talking about conflict and the superpowers in the Horn of Africa. And I found so many people talking about security of the Horn of Africa, but nobody told us what security of the people of the Horn of Africa really meant. And that's when I came to the issue that refugee issues there were part of the structure that destabilized or stabilized states. That development was so crucial, that human rights were so important that we cannot remove this from our considerations of security. That was long before the United Nations came up with human security. But the point I'm trying to make here is that actually following the thinking in international society or the thinking in the English School of International Relations, you can come to the view that whether we're looking at science, technology, and innovation, or other values, particularly justice, order, democracy, and environmental management, all these need to be taken into account when we are calculating our security. And therefore, we have to view order among humankind, as Hedley Bull said, as being more fundamental and more primordial than order among states. And hence, if we're not providing food for the people starving in the Horn of Africa, we are not giving them the security they need. If we're not providing water or food security or food supplies and that kind of stuff, it is a problem for them. That's how I look at it.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Samuel. It seems that the version of security that you present to us, or drawing on Hadley Bull, is almost at odds with the picture of the world that we've heard now, that we've been given by Rana and by Igor, right? Where on the one hand, there is the need to focus on people, well, food that you just mentioned in the Horn of Africa, the social dimension, right? But on the other hand, we also live in the world where we have the reality of the aggression in Ukraine and of economic interests as well. Thomas, if you come in here, maybe from your background also on the leading school of international relations, can that help us understand how these political interests intersect with these other dimensions, the economic one, the social one, if we use that as a lens to understand the world today?
Thank you so much for having me, and happy International Women's Day to everyone. It's funny or interesting if you look at it from where I'm positioned, that I am just located very close to the global hegemon. So as Canadians, we get a lot from the American, but then I study African issue, which is to some extent a non-great power trying to push for a world that is a much more equitable. And that's where the Legon School, I'll go into the Legon School in a moment. But I want to comment say two things about great power politics. Because two things. The first one is that the post-1945 world that was created has been created with this idea that the best way to maintain peace in the global system is this balance of power, balance of threat idea. If you pick it, if you read Kenneth Watts, not Kenneth Watts, Stephen Watts's work, that to some extent has made Western policymakers, I should say policymakers in general, believe that somehow you'll be able to protect and maintain peace when you have a clearly defined enemy that you are working towards. And that, to me, that social construction of peace is part of the problem that we have in the international system, right? That you have policymakers around the world who think that once you have a threat clearly defined here, then I can design a policy, make all of us, pushes us into a world where our one attempt to create defense mechanisms, some will say, will pose a threat to the other end. And yesterday I was listening to the dialogue between China and that of the US in terms of how US is saying that we are not seeking war, but what we want is that we want fair competition. On the other hand, China is also saying that your actions, the decisions that you are making, it's making your decisions are leading us into a possibility of a war, right? That if you don't change, we may end up, the new Chinese foreign minister is making that particular point. I think that is something that for those of us who care so much about global security, that is something that we, all of us, should think and in some cases should consider that as a very important part of the way we think about global security. That is that the best way to approach international, that somehow you always have to have a clearly defined enemy to be able to come out with a policy. So that's the first one that I wanted. The second point that I think is very important for us to bear in mind is this idea that, and for us, I think if you live very close to the US, there's a genuine feeling among American policymakers that we live in their world, or the way I like to put it is in this way, that it's a kind of, we live in American, if you look at the computer analogy, that the American world, American processor, that all of us operate within that processor, right? And that is very deeply held within the American policy establishment. And the question then is that if you're outside of the American bubble, how do you then respond to this, processor? Or if you are not part of the operating machine? And that, I think, one of the things I wanted to put on the table before we go, I go into the Legon School of, and from the Legon School perspective, obviously from, they look at the world from an equity lens. And from an equity lens, this world that has been created from the post-1945 is a world of a making of great powers, of which small powers are largely absent from it. And the number of them, and I get it, I speak, I work a lot on the African Union, so I often get a chance to understand African leaders and the way they think about the world. And from their perspective, this global security architecture that has been created is a world that is not actually peaceful. It's actually a world that always we have peace that is only episodic, right? It's just only episodic, a small time that we enjoy a little bit of peace, but over a long term, it's very insecure. And therefore, a new world can be envisioned where all parties within the international system actually sit down, and then a world is created which is much more fair and equitable. A world that is not based on equity. That's where the Legon School of IR comes in, that a world that is not based on equity, but is based on great power competition is not a peaceful world. So for us to think about having peace, we might have to put equity at the heart of it. And that leads to so many different questions. So that's, I think, just for an opening statement, I just wanted to put this on the table, and I'll come back, and I'm looking forward to a much more detailed conversation as we move forward.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Thomas. You put out a very challenging, notion of global security by saying, well, we need to have a world where everyone is included, a world that is more equitable. The question is, how do we actually achieve that, right? And how do we get there, given the current situation? So I'd like to ask you all, when we think about the prospects for global governance of global security issues, but also across the different levels, because of course it's not just states, it is also at the at the city level that we need to think about, at the level of people, at the regional level. We heard about the African Union. What are the prospects here? And maybe also, if you would like to respond to any of the comments that have been made by other panelists, how would you tie it to what we just heard about, those very different visions in terms of how we think about global security? Rana, would you like to start, maybe? Give us your thoughts.
I think this is the moment for me to throw in a concept, which is now, I'd say, one of the 2 or 3 hottest concepts in Chinese political thinking right now. And that's what Xi Jinping, but obviously the propaganda and information authorities around him have characterized as the Global Security Initiative. This is something that is being promoted very heavily through official channels in China. It's very much the flavor. And I think it was heard, amongst other things, if I'm not wrong, at Munich just a few weeks ago. Now, this is one of these things that I think is very important for the discussion we're having, because I think there's one dimension that is directed very inwardly towards a Chinese domestic audience, and one that's directed towards the international community. And the question of whether these two things can be made compatible is immensely important. Bear in mind that security in Chinese, anqian, can mean safety as well, but it has also that strong sense of security in the sense of defensiveness, holding back too much exposure to the outside world in case things don't work out terribly well. And that's partly driven by China's own sense of insecurity from its history, particularly from the mid-19th and mid-20th century, when it's repeatedly invaded and occupied by a variety of other European countries and, of course, Japan. And that dynamic, that vibe, you might say, still shapes a China which today is much stronger and much more stable in the international community than it was 50 to 100 years ago. So I think domestically, the idea of China being at the center of a global security network, framework, order, if we want to put it that way, I think that's fine, is very much about protection of the home base. And to some extent, that's not that different from some of the discourse about the United States of America. Obviously, America has free media and a much wider range of voices around these questions. But overall, I don't think it would be unreasonable to suggest that a very key element of global security for the US is a question of how it secures the homeland at home. There's even a department since 2001 called Homeland Security. And I think that's not a bad way of thinking about what the Chinese element is as well. So what does that element mean at home? Well, it means some of the things we've been talking about: economic security and food security. Food security is massive in China at the moment. China has always been a food importing country, and that's true, the Ming dynasty and the Qing dynasty. This is not just recently at all. And some of the questions around, for instance, cereal exports from Russia, Ukraine, relate to those sorts of issues. Obviously, in terms of military security, there's a whole new sense that actually defending China against a possible Western confrontation is an important element too. So if you're Chinese, you can see how all that plays at home. The question is, why would the rest of the world be interested in that? And that's, I think, where China has begun to really think about putting out a global element to the security agenda. And I'll briefly outline what that is, and then it'd be great to have everyone else here say if they recognize any of these elements. I think it's about defining security for the wider world, largely through economic means. It's a form of solidarism. I was glad to have, I think it was Samuel was mentioning that whole dimension that comes through solidarism and the world that emerges from that. In China's terms, clearly something like R2P is a very, very dangerous and problematic agenda. But what's not problematic is the idea that, for instance, by increasing economic security, and particularly areas like technological infrastructure, China can first of all find an opportunity for itself, because Chinese tech infrastructure is cheap and heavily subsidized by the government. It's also, of course, highly susceptible to interference from China, but many countries accept that bargain and actually take it because it has high usability and it's cheaply available. But second, it also provides, I think, a much stronger positive moral narrative that China is very, very keen to put forward. China does not want to be seen as a realist actor in the world. It wants to be seen as a moral actor in the world. And I think by using those elements of economic, technological security that come from promoting green growth through non-fossil fuel energy, I'm thinking here of things like solar panels, which of course China has huge capacity in, that kind of 5G rollout that I've mentioned before, and also to some extent actually broader healthcare initiatives. That was going quite well at one point during COVID because of the exports of Chinese vaccines, but now Chinese vaccines are not accepted as being terribly effective. And anyway, COVID itself is slightly shifting in terms of global perception. But I wouldn't underestimate the way in which institutions such as the World Health Organization, which of course has got very strong Chinese influence, can be used as part of that agenda to get to health security as a way of painting why the rest of the world should care about and indeed be positive about the Chinese definitions. The one element, of course, that this steps away from, as I was saying before, is the idea of individuated liberties as part of that securitization. So that is, I think, where the debate about language, but also the cold, hard reality of economics, because to make this work properly, China's private sector and public sector have to act together to essentially suggest that there is some substance behind the rhetoric of China's global security program actually being advantageous to the wider world.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Rana. You pointed to this different version of how we even think about global security, right? From a domestic perspective, how countries try to impose, if you want, even their own framework, but often that lacks, of course, also the global dimension. And you also referred to the relevance of organizations like the World Health Organization. So I wonder, perhaps coming back first here to Thomas, also thinking about your work on the African Union, these regional organizations, how do they come in? I mean, we've heard about the state level, the individual level, but of course the regional level is also important. Perhaps you can bring that in, and if you can also, everyone just keep your responses brief to make sure we can get everyone's response as well. Thomas, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, I will try to be brief. I think first of all, we know very well that prospects for global governance at the UN level is deadlocks. Although the African countries would like to think that there's a possibility of a UN reforms with a proper representation from the African region. At the moment, the way it is structured, we all know very well that it is structured in an unfair manner to countries that were under colonial rule when the UN structure was created. So that's the first one. So at least from the African Union perspective, the prospect of a global governance would look like a world of regions, right? So a world where regional organizations have the power as well as the means to be able to resolve problems that they consider to be at home, right? So from the African Union perspective, they would want to see a situation where the African Union is the lead actor on African security issues, that the African Union becomes the first point of call whenever there's a problem within the African region. And once again, they also want to think about it in terms of not just only the African Union as an institutions, but what they consider to be the building blocks of the African Union, which is a regional economic community, such as the Economic Community of West African States, the East African Community, and the Southern African Development Community, for example, as building block of a new world where regional organization can be the main actor within the international system. So from the African Union perspective, African issues must be dealt with at a regional level, because none of the states within the African region, and they will say that around the world, is capable of resolving the challenges that we have in the world, which is much more interconnected and in such a way that no one country will be able to, however big you are, you may be the United States or China, but you cannot get your own domestic security unless you work within your regional counterpart. So that's the way I think, at least on the African continent, the prospect for global governance is perceived. Let me end this here, and then hopefully we'll get more chance to talk about other issues as well.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Thomas. Samuel, perhaps here, continuing on the notion of the regional security. You mentioned before that in the Horn of Africa, people talk about the security of the Horn of Africa rather than the people. What does that then mean for governance, right? And when you think even about the regional interests, that's still not necessarily the interests of people. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I will just pick up from where Thomas left. I think Thomas has done a better job on the African Union than I have, but I have my differences with the African Union on a number of issues. It talks about having African solutions for African problems, but it has no way of designing its own solutions. I've just published a chapter in which I've argued that the lack of knowledge in Africa is a big disadvantage. It's not just a disadvantage in terms of development, but also a disadvantage in terms of security and peace, because they come up arguing that we want African solutions to African problems, but they have to rely on funding from the so-called international partners. They have to rely on advice from outside, advice which is generated by people who have no interest in pursuing the type of problems they want to pursue. They don't even keep records. If you go to the African Union and say, okay, now you have been engaged in this type of peacekeeping operations in West Africa, Central Africa, the Horn of Africa, where is the lessons learned section where we can learn some of these things? You don't find a thing. And I say this also to suggest that this is not just something which studied recently, because in the 1990s, I was recruited by the UNDP as a conflict analyst and seconded to the Organization of African Unity. I thought that was a dream job, because working for the United Nations while at the same time working for the African Union was a dream job. When I got to Addis Ababa and asked for documents, the library, it was like you are looking for top secrets. Nobody wanted, they just look at you. What is this person looking for? So the problem we have is that they don't keep records. They don't have archives. The documents you give them, they throw away. I will point out one small thing, and then I'll leave the discussion to others. The African Union in 2007 established the African Union Border Program. That border program was doing a very good job trying to demarcate African borders, trying to help African countries actually deal with a situation whereby only 25% of African borders to this day have been settled. So 75% have not been settled. And the African Union border program was doing a very good job. And the funding came from the EU. At one stage, 2013, I think, 2013, the German government moved in, supported its organization, I think it's GIZ in short, I think it means something else. And they displaced the personnel at the African Union. If you check right now, in the official African Union record, you don't even find the African Union Porter Program. But if you check the website of GIZ, you find that it has stated it is helping the African Union settle its border problems. So the problem there is lack of proper leadership, lack of knowledge, and no willingness to provide the funding for the programs they want.
Thank you so much.
Well,
Thanks.
sorry to be negative. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Samuel. It's interesting to see this tension here, right, between how organizations present themselves versus then what happens behind the scenes. Now, Igor, we heard about the regional efforts in Africa. We heard about China wanting to be seen as a moral actor globally. Now, what's the role of Russia here? I mean, we know the government, the regime of the Kremlin spreads a certain narrative at home, but how can we think about Russia's role to enhance security in cooperation with others at the global level?
Well, first of all, I'd like to comment on what has already been said, and my comments will be more consonant with what Rana said. Getting back to this idea of global security, I believe that it depends not on the so-called balances of power, but on whether there is a common perception of what constitutes global threats. This is the problem. And when we have a look at, if we have a look at the United Nations organizations, we definitely find out that as Thomas told, the United Nations organization is in deadlock, actually. And then we go down to a lower level, that is regional organizations. But we have several of those organizations. But the level of integrity, the level of common understanding, what constitutes the global threats, is absolutely different. G20 is dysfunctional, in my view. Have a look. I mean, what worked in 2008, they were effective. I mean, G20 format was effective. We have to admit it. But now, have a look at what's going on. The recent G20 foreign ministers meeting, where some representatives of countries of the global south, they said that, well, what happens in Ukraine? Well, problems of Europe is not a problem. Problem of Europe is not a problem of the world. This is something that we've heard. But the war in Ukraine has its repercussions, definitely global repercussions, because have a look at how the Western countries, they started reassessing their the economic security, the issues of economic security. Now it's they reassess their attitude with regard to China. That is, the Western politicians understood that it's not that secure importing or exporting goods to non-democratic states, non-democratic markets. This is something that is already going on. I mean, this reassessment. Another point I would like to make is that getting back to Russia. Yes, Russia, it's interesting that before 2022, no one could, I mean, very few people could have imagined that the European system of security, the regional system, would be built in a way that Russia would be perceived as a permanent source of threats. And this is how it looks like nowadays. Russia is perceived as a permanent source of threats, and the European security will be built not with Russia, but against Russia, actually. So Russia is against European security. and the attitude to Ukraine has changed. Ukraine now is perceived as an element of this European security. Rana mentioned this Munich conference, and this was astonishing. I mean, like compare it with 1 year ago. 1 year ago, it was, the organizers of the Munich Security Conference, they held so-called German-Russian business breakfasts. This is not something that you cannot imagine nowadays or next year or within the next 10 years. Previously, Ukraine was regarded as a kind of part of sphere of influence on Russia. And the organizers of the Munich Security Conference, they produced reports how to accommodate Russia, how to find compromises at the expense of Ukraine. Now, everything has been changed. Ukraine is perceived as a member of Euro-Atlantic structures in the future. So that will be my view on that.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Igor. We don't have much time left, and I just would like to make sure that we can also address some of the questions by the audience. So I have here one question. It's actually to all of the panelists, which is that, I'll just read it out to you. It seems that many of you touch on some form of normative agendas. China is trying to be a moral leader. Thomas talked about a more equitable world order. Samuel mentioned individual security, and Igor mentioned the Kremlin's centrality of identity. So the question here, the person is asking, to what extent do normative agendas guide the political actions of these different states? And I would add here, what are the implications then for global security? And if you could also, in your response, just at the very end, just bring in your recommendations on which book or a publication, a podcast, would you recommend to our audience to better understand global security? We're collecting that in each session and then put that together as a list. So if you could just be brief, 1 minute each, what is the role of the normative agenda and what is the recommended reading or podcast that especially students might want to listen to or read? Shall we start with Samuel this time, perhaps?
Thank you very much, Annette. I would like to say that I believe that security has to be pursued from a normative position. And when I teach even a unit like US foreign policy, I always try to look at what I call the policy legitimacy basis of that policy, of that foreign policy. Normative legitimacy, which means that the policy has to be consistent with the values, the norms, and institutions of the society which they are serving. The policies that we pursue, whether security or just foreign policy, diplomacy, whatever it is, they should not be inconsistent or should not be offensive to our values and institutions. That's how I look at it. And in that way, they're going to be supported by the public, they're going to be supported by the media, and they'll be more sustainable.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, about the book.
Yes.
I have. I would like to recommend 2 books because of the things that I'm talking about. I like to recommend first a book by Kwame Anthony Appiah. It's called The Lies That Bind, Rethinking Identity. It was based on the BBC Wreath Lectures of 2016, which were first broadcast on BBC Radio 4 in, I think, 2016. If you look at that book, I think it gives us ground to rethink, critique, and reevaluate our own attachments to countries, culture, class, color, whatever it is. So that's one of the books that I recommend. The second one is a slightly older book by Michael Doyle. It's called Ways of War, and Peace, published in 1997. It applies contemporary social science methods to review and critique classical theories of international relations. For instance, it provides an excellent analytical and I would say eclectic assessment of classical theorists through Machiavelli, Hobbes, Rousseau, Locke, Bentham, Smith, Kant, up to Lenin.
Right.
So those are very good books for understanding geopolitics. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Samuel. Igor, what's your view on the role of normative agendas in your recommended book or other output?
Yes, I actually agree with Samuel. The normative, actually, it would be better if we perceive the global security through the lens of normative approach. The problem is that the decision makers they not necessarily follow this normative approach. When it comes to books, and you said podcasts as well. So, I believe that there is no book where you can find a universal recipe to better understand global security. It's obvious. I always recommend to read as much as possible and to do it systematically. That's important. And it's important to move from smaller things to bigger things, not vice versa, in my view. That's my personal approach. And it's Umberto Eco once described why it's useful to do it that way. And when you find interesting points and ideas, and before embracing them, before putting them into your mindset, please test them carefully and verify data and argumentation behind those points, and do it by yourself, do it personally. With regard to books, the books I could recommend, they are related to the regional issues. For instance, the book by Sergei Plokhy, the director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, The Last Empire, on the collapse of the Soviet Union and the role of the Ukrainian issue. It discovers lots of interesting ideas and points on how the current Russian leadership perceives Ukraine. That is, there are many interesting things. With regard to podcasts, I like personally the podcast by Brian Whitmore, Power Vertical. It's really interesting in my opinion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thanks, Igor. Thomas, what's your view on the normative agenda and your recommendation?
And norms or normative thinking has to be always at the center of security. Otherwise, what's the purpose of global security, right? I think the key for me, though, is what kind of norms are we going to allow to drive our security agenda? And I think the world that we live in is a world where my sense is that we overvalue power as a normative agenda, the importance of global power at the expense, in my opinion, of equality. And therefore, if we're going to live in a world which is going to be peaceful, that world has to be a world of inclusivity, and that world has to be a world based on equity, not just equity between states or among states, but also equity at the state level and at the individual level. So that's the last point I would say, is that we have to remember that the world is a world of our making. We construct the world. We construct peace, we construct security, we construct threat. And therefore, in everything that we do, we have to remember that whatever we do, whatever we write, the narrative, the discourses, all contribute to either creating a threat or creating peace. And therefore, from a normative perspective, we always have to be mindful and watch for what we say, what we write, and what we decide to prioritize in the way in whether we would do. In terms of a book, I will be very short on this because my sense is that it's always difficult to identify one or two books that you can find, as Igor pointed out. But I would recommend for students, I think there are certain think tanks and institutions that are producing really good work on global security that I would recommend to students to follow. Just outside a few of them across the world, just one will be the Center for Strategic and International Studies, for example. They produce really good work, including podcasts that for students you can follow. It's a very small think tank institution in Canada here. People don't know, but they also produce really good work called CG, Center for International Governance Innovation. They also do the same good books. And then obviously your own work as well as Chatham House, the World by Chatham House. And on the African continent, if you really want to understand, I think ISS, Institute for Security Studies, they also do very good work and they produce. But just to end with, given what the way I started, we have to understand security to some extent from American perspective, whether we like it or not. And my recommendation will be Stephen Watts's Balance. It's an old book, but Stephen Watts's Balance of Threat. I think is very important for those who want to understand global security. Read it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Rana, could you help us close the webinar with your...
Very briefly. I think the thing that I would look out for as, overall the greatest macro threat to security is sudden shocks. And I think recently in at least the global north, the Ukraine-Russia war has been a very good example of that. It's salutary, as we've noted in conversations in the wider world in the last few weeks and months, that isn't necessarily as transformative for the global south, and it's important to remember that element of perspective. But I would say, just putting it at the end here, that a disruptive and transformative set of events, whether they're sanctions or economic based or indeed military confrontation in the Asia Pacific region, would have a global ripple effect, which certainly would go well beyond the area itself, even though it would be devastating there. So I think it is a security crisis that can and should be managed ahead of time. And on that grounds, I'll give you one book which deals with that question. The Avoidable War by former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, and even more important perhaps, former PhD student, DPhil student at Oxford, Kevin Rudd, who got his DPhil from Oxford last year to the great pride of many of us here, and is going on to distinguished service as the Australian ambassador to the United States. The point is that he's in a very, very small category of people, Western politicians who speak fluent Mandarin Chinese. I think we're going to need a few more of them in the years ahead, and not just Westerners either. Okay, thanks very much, Annette.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Rana. But thanks to all of you for support for the recommendations. I think our students now have a long reading list and food for thought. Thanks also for your excellent contributions. Of course, this is the start of a conversation. We could have continued much longer. But as I said, we have a webinar series. We're continuing in 4 more weeks, and we'll also follow up with you on further discussions. So thank you so much. Thanks to all the panelists. Thanks to the audience, and goodbye.